Tonight we're in Exeter and welcome to Question Time. And with me tonight, Suella Braverman, elected an MP in 2015, a campaigner for Brexit, now a minister in the Department for Leaving the EU. Clive Lewis, Labour MP, who resigned from the Shadow Cabinet last year to vote against Brexit, but is now back in, shadowing the Treasury. The Swedish billionaire businessman who's worked for both Conservative and Labour governments, Johan Elias. Helen Lewis, deputy editor of The New Statesman. And the broadcaster, columnist and contributor to ITV's Loose Women, Janet Street-Porter. Good, thanks very much. And remember, as ever, our hashtag BBCQT if you want to go on social media, if you dare, with comments on what's being said. Let's take our first question from Jess John, please. Jess John.
So, we know that the UK tolerated the US torturing prisoners. Should there be prosecutions for those who allowed it?
This is the report that came out today, which says that the government were aware, was the words they used, of inexcusable mistreatment of suspected terrorists by the US, but did very little to stop or prevent it. Suella Braverman.
Well, I think that it's obviously a very serious report that's come out about the treatment of detainees during that very fraught period after 9/11. It's right that we acknowledge that UK personnel were working within a new and challenging environment after the attacks on the World Trade Center, and their priority was to prevent further loss of life. I think it's important that there will, from the report, the Prime Minister has announced today that there will be further consideration of how things proceed and a review so that we make sure we get the balance right in future scenarios like this.
What do you mean by get the balance right? Well, is there a balance between sending people off to be tortured and not sending them off to be tortured?
I think there's a very difficult tension in a situation like this, when you're under high alert, when there is a threat. Our security services, our agents on the front line are working under pressure where there's a real threat of violence. But at the same time, we've got to balance the protection for human rights. We mustn't mistreat people, and we must make sure that the rule of law is abided to at all times.
Clive Lewis.
I'm afraid that I think this is the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's potentially out there. You know, look, the saying once was that all that evil requires to triumph is that good people do nothing. And we have had members of our security services not just stand by and watch, but not actively participate. I'm quite clear about that. But sometimes guide the interrogations. I mean, this is outrageous. We have breached so many conventions by doing this. And, you know, look, as the world kind of descends with strongmen around the world, Viktor Orban, Trump, Erdogan, the rule of law is dissipating before our very eyes. And it's important that in this country, we can show quite clearly that we will stand up for the morality and the principles and the values of this country. I'm afraid to say, this looks like a pretty gloomy chapter so far. And it's one that we haven't heard the end of, because it also came up in the report that the government has blocked some of the investigations here, so that some of the agents concerned have not been interviewed. And I think, actually, that's something the government has to answer. Theresa May cannot stand there and say that we've got this under control, that this won't happen again, unless they allow the Security Committee to have a full and frank and thorough investigation into this so we can get to the bottom of it.
And, Should there be prosecutions, was the question Jess John asked.
I think what we need to see is a judge-led review. I think that the report is also calling for the police to investigate further. But if there are people who are found to have broken the law, then yes, there should be prosecution.
Helen Lewis.
I agree, exactly. We don't have the evidence yet, but if there is evidence that people have to be prosecuted, then we have to see the rule of law done. I agree with what Clive says. We're at a really dark moment in the world now. You know, Donald Trump does not respect human rights. I think he would gladly throw out all human rights legislation if he absolutely could. And what we have to do as Britain is stand up for that rules-based order. It worries me when you see people saying one of the great things about Brexit will be able to pull out of European human rights legislation. These are exactly the kind of people that human rights legislation is designed for. The worst people in the world still deserve human rights. Unfortunately, that is the thing we have to say. No matter how bad you are, no matter what you do, it is a test of us as people, what we're prepared to do to the worst people in the world.
You, sir, in the second row there.
It's been well over a decade since this stuff happened, and we're only just learning about it. What can we do to actually stop this stuff being hidden again? Because who knows what we'll be finding out about what the government has been supporting and been kind of contributing to in a decade's time.
OK. Janet's reporter.
Well, I agree with you, because if it happened a decade ago and we're only finding out, it's only slowly coming out now, announcing a review will just delay the date that we'll find out more. And I also worry that if we leave the EU, what is going to happen? Who are going to be our allies? Who's going to help us maintain human rights and protect the rights of prisoners? And especially in situations where we send the British Army into situations where they're under threat, they take prisoners, we have to know that there are certain rules that will never, ever be broken, and that if people break those rules about relating to human rights, that they will pay the punishment. But the fact that this has taken 10 years to come out makes me really doubt. You know, it's a worry.
The person at the very back there.
I'm sorry, I just want to go back to what Helen said about Donald Trump throwing out all human rights legislation. And I wondered if you just considered the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the US Constitution, as a piece of human rights legislation, because I don't think even he could throw that out. And I don't think that he would. So I'm just saying that I don't think that's completely true.
No, I think you make a very good point, and things like free speech and, well, the right to bear arms, I think he's certainly very, very keen on. But what I mean is that his instincts are, as Clive said, with the authoritarians of the world, it's very noticeable that he's really uncomfortable around Angela Merkel, but he's actually realistically quite comfortable around Viktor Orban or Putin, perhaps, or, you know, the leader of North Korea. So what I'm talking about is I don't think that he recognises the constraints of a rules-based order in the way that we in this country do. That is, those are his instincts. Whether or not he is able to carry them out is another matter.
You, sir.
Let's be clear. Clive Lewis is recommending a cogent and thorough investigation into the Labour administration of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown.
Yes, very much so. Very much. Let's be quite clear here. You don't just find... Human rights don't stop because your party's in power and you don't quite like the answers that you might find. This has to bring out the answers. It has to get to the truth. But I mean, I just want to bring up a point here about talking about Trump and others. Talking about Trump and Orban and others. But I am going to mention Boris Johnson because he's an admirer of Trump. We don't have to look abroad to see... I mean, I was in the chamber this week and Michael Fabricant was egging his government on to also pull the UK out of the UN Human Rights Committee. So, you know, look, it's not just happening over there. We're seeing it in the kind of extreme politics that are now gripping our country in this place here. Right. So it's not always just other countries.
Jan.
What do I think? Well, this was actually 17 years ago. It was a long time ago. It was scary times. We just had September 11. We made decisions to go along with the Americans, which had consequences. There were probably lots of things going on which lots of countries had knowledge of, because the coalition was a broad coalition. And there were other members of that coalition who I think would never ever even let this get to the surface. But in this country, which is a great country, we're very transparent. And yes, as the report showed, there were instances of torture. Mind you, there is actually, according to the UN and the Human Rights Convention, there is certain so-called torture which is allowed. I've never understood why, because torture is torture. I did military service, and we were actually tortured for practice, just to know what it would be if we got captured. And it's horrible, even if it is for practice. So I think it's terrible. But that said, those were times which were very difficult. I'm sure that our intelligence officials, operatives, they reported this up the chain. So the question is, who did something wrong? And if they did not follow the law, of course they need to be prosecuted, and that must not be allowed to happen ever again. That's my position.
So that not doing anything to prevent mistreatment would count, in your view, as something that could be prosecuted. In other words, if you knew that people were victims of rendition and were then being tortured and you didn't prevent that happening, that would be a
prosecution. Prosecution is for those, should apply to those who broke the law.
Okay.
If no one broke the law, maybe we should have a close look at the law. I don't know.
But hang on, but doing little to prevent, is that breaking the law or is that just looking the other way?
Now, that is a question for a legal expert. And all I know is that you can be guilty by not speaking out.
All right, I'll take one more point from the woman on the gangway there in blue. Yes.
I don't have an answer to this, but my question is back to you and the audience. Is if your family member was saved by the torture and the release of information, or if 9/11 had been prevented by the torture of somebody that released that information, is it justified then?
Let me ask Jess John, who asked the question. What do you think, Jess?
No. It's human rights. It's not... We have to abide by the rules and the law. We cannot just fight terrorism with terrorism and bad behaviour. People did stuff that were wrong. They were complicit in that, and we are guilty by proxy. We cannot just turn a blind eye to crime.
Yes, go on.
If you call it a war and people are killed in war, soldiers shoot people in war, what's the difference? I mean, it's okay to kill people in war, but it's not okay to stop and save lives? I mean, I don't have the answer to it, but I'm just posing the question.
But by posing it, you suggest you think the answer may be that it's permissible.
I think we need to think about both sides. I think it's not as straightforward as just saying human rights, okay, but war shooting people in the face is fine.
Okay. And the woman there on the right, you, ma'am. Yes. No, sorry, up there.
I've actually carried out some research on public reactions to torture, and I've found that more than the effectiveness of using torture, what makes people decide whether or not they'll support it is whether or not they identify with the person being tortured. So if it's a member of our in-group, we're more likely to disapprove of the use of torture and think it's morally incorrect than if it's someone we don't feel any particular identification with. So effectiveness, I was very surprised when I found the data. Effectiveness is not one of the main criteria when it comes to deciding whether or not we support it.
And you sit down here. Yes, you.
Thank you. Just picking up Johann's point, you mentioned about illegality at all times needing to be prosecuted. It just makes me wonder, what about when the war itself that we use to retaliate with is illegal? When the United Nations said that they didn't give us a mandate to go into Iraq, but yet half of our parliament gave us permission to go in there. Could we use the argument that we were just as bad as the people that are doing the torturing? Because that in itself was an illegal war.
What do you say?
No, it was not. It was actually not an illegal war. We can debate on the facts and circumstances based upon which Parliament gave the go-ahead. That's a different issue. But Parliament, in the end, gave the green light for our country to go to war.
But don't make news.
Fake news, fake information.
And don't wars have to be given the okay by the United Nations like the war in Afghanistan was? They said, yes, go into Afghanistan, don't go into Iraq. So therefore it's illegal because we signed up to the United Nations Charter of Human Rights.
I mean, I think you raise a really good point, but it is, to me, a completely separate point. And I think that the idea of the kind of ticking bomb scenario is what's always used in discussions. And actually, luckily, it doesn't come up because all the evidence suggests that information obtained under torture is junk information. What happens if you torture people is they just say things. They say things so you will stop torturing them. And actually, I think I think it's a good thought experiment to run, but it is not one that applies in the real world.
All right. Let's move on. So as always, we've got a long list of questions. We've selected some from, and I want to get through some of them. Just to say, we're in King's Lynn next week, and on the screen there is how to apply. If you want to come to King's Lynn, you'll be extremely welcome. A question from Matilda O'Callaghan, please.
Why are we continuing to ignore environmental issues in favour of short-term profiteering by building Heathrow's third runway?
Heathrow's third runway, which got the go-ahead this week. Clive Lewis.
I think the decision that we've seen this week on the government backing and supporting Heathrow was wrong. We now know that that's going to add another 3.3 megatons of carbon into the environment. We're already at the edge of that. This week, the Climate Change Committee has reported back that the government is now off target, way off target, with its climate change commitments and carbon targets. And in the very same week, this government voted for Heathrow's expansion. I was in the chamber 5 minutes before it had just dumped the Swansea Tidal Lagoon Bay. This was an opportunity to put our country on the front foot, invest in the technology, jobs, skills, things that we can export to give clean, green energy for the next 90 years in this country and to be at the leading cutting edge of renewable technologies. And they've thrown it out and gone for Heathrow.
How did you get over 100 Labour MPs voting for it? You're obviously not very persuasive in the Labour Party.
Well, we had a free vote, and we had a free vote because this is a...
You must have talked about it with them.
We did, and there was communication, but it was a free vote because it's a complex issue. And it's a complex issue because some MPs believe that their cash-starved constituencies that have had a lack of investment for the last 8 years desperately needed this investment. However, the front bench position was that there are no jobs on a dead planet. This did not meet our 4 tests. The climate change commitments in this, the social equality component of this investment wasn't there. The toxic dumping of the aircraft fuel onto our cities hadn't been mitigated. It failed every test, and we didn't think it should go forward.
Johan, do you agree with him?
Well, I was part of the government, actually your party, 2010, when we gave approval to it, and had a little to say in terms of that. One factor which is often ignored is that, and if you think about it, whenever you fly into Heathrow, you always have to go into a hold, sometimes 45 minutes. Why is that? It's because of all this traffic. So by having a third runway, we can actually reduce carbon emissions by about 3-4 million tons a year.
So it's better to have a third runway.
Yeah. Which is about 5% of our total carbon emissions, which is quite an astounding fact.
So you should have a fourth runway and then you reduce it even further.
I don't think there is space for that. But the other thing one also has to take into consideration, what are the alternatives? So there was the Thames estuary, there is Gatwick, and there is Heathrow. Those were the alternatives. So which is, it's like a Morton's fork. You have to pick one, and they're all bad.
I suppose Exeter wouldn't have done the job, really, would it?
Slightly too far out.
Slightly too small. Janet?
Well, I feel passionately that this was an appalling decision for all sorts of reasons. We've got Michael Gove telling us to stop burning logs, stop using plastic straws, and we've got all these Mickey Mouse green initiatives. And I honestly think that Theresa May sees herself as some kind of reborn green goddess. How can she stand up and tell us to do all our recycling, solar panels on our roofs and so on, and agree that Heathrow is great for Great Britain? all sorts of things annoy me about this. Number one, a motorway has actually got to be moved at the cost of billions and billions of pounds. Number two, the government is building a high-speed train to the north where, if we needed more airport capacity, we could have had it at Manchester or an airport in the north. The second thing is that the Heathrow Airport is used primarily by people on expensive flights. Most of the people watching this programme and most of the people in this audience do not go through Heathrow. They travel on budget airlines out of Luton, Stansted and so on. Heathrow is used by businessmen and women who get off one plane and get on another one. Another environmental impact of building another runway and increasing the number of flights into Heathrow is that we will have acres of duty-free shops. And what do they sell? Crap you don't need that's wrapped in plastic.
Well, Matilda raises an important point about the environmental impacts of this Heathrow expansion. And I think that they are dealt with in the proposal. And I'm actually very much proud to have supported the government in taking this historic decision to move forward with it. We've been talking about this for over 20 years. I can remember it in the 80s. In Hong Kong, it took them 5 years to build a similar-sized airport. We've got to get real. Heathrow is full, and aviation demand is growing. If we want to sit on our hands for years and years and years and watch the rest of the world move forward, we can do that. But I don't want to say no to billions of pounds of investment to our economy, thousands of jobs, unionised jobs, which Len McCluskey supports, and apprenticeships, which are going to support our young people. But importantly, this is going to take us forward in our aviation capacity to work with the global demand. And on the environmental impact, there are hugely stringent requirements on this proposal. If it doesn't meet the government's very strict air quality requirements, it won't go ahead. And let's just recall this. It's not someone in Whitehall who's going to keep emissions low.
Sorry,
it's going to be our innovators.
If it doesn't meet it's already got the go-ahead. Now you're going to say, oh, actually, we got it wrong, it doesn't add up.
No, because what was announced this week and what was voted on, supported by many Labour MPs, was the policy framework. A proposal now needs to go for planning permission, and that begins another procedure whereby the actual decision to deliver it gets made. But on the environment, aviation technology is moving at a very fast pace. A Boeing 737 that we used to go on holiday in the 80s was 26% less efficient and damaging to the environment than it is today. And in the next 10 years, a Boeing 737, again, is going to have a low emission rate. This is good for our economy, it's good for our environment, and it's good for Britain.
OK, and thank you.
And I'll bet these planes don't fly over your constituency. Do these planes, are they going to fly over your constituency? No.
Because it's Fareham and they don't come that way. The person up there, the spectacles in the back there, yes.
If the issue mattered so much to him, why wasn't Boris Johnson in the country for this vote in the Commons?
Right, Suella.
And Philip Hammond.
Yeah, the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, was in India at a business conference
also
as well.
But
he didn't say
how he
in front of a bulldozer, did he?
And,
no, I'm aware.
And Boris Johnson, who must have added to pollution a certain amount by flying out to Afghanistan.
Very important.
Well, our planes are very efficient these days, so...
So why wasn't he there? What do you make of
I can't answer for Boris. Boris made clear his views before. He's got duties as Foreign Secretary. I'm not his diary secretary. I don't manage his whereabouts. Boris can answer for himself and to his constituents as he wishes.
Helen Lewis.
I think that's a really important point to raise, because collective cabinet responsibility is one of the fundamental things about our democracy. You need to have an accountability of government, and that means people have to take responsibility for the decisions they make. You can't get a note from your mum to get out of PE, which is basically what Boris Johnson did this week, right?
Theresa
May exactly what it was.
The woman in green there on the gangway, yes. No, the woman in green. We're not doing very well tonight. There you are. There. Yes.
It occurs to me that the third runway in Heathrow is likely to be moot. If we leave the EU as currently predicted and drop out of the Open Skies Agreement, there won't be any flights to go in and out of
It would just be, yes, going by ship. And the woman in yellow here, what do you think?
With all the businesses that are leaving Britain now and are saying they're going to leave after Brexit, we may not need the runway anyway.
OK. Part of your thinking?
Well, I was just going to say, and listening to Suella there, I mean, Chris Grayling spent about 10 to 12 deeply unsatisfactory seconds on outlining the carbon mitigation programme that he was going to put in place. It doesn't exist yet. It's all on technologies that haven't been invented and show no sign of being invented. It's at Never Never Land. And I think what we saw in that vote in mainstream party politics for the first time was a clear divide between those politicians who think that you can negotiate with climate physics and those that don't. And the Tory party seems to think it can negotiate with climate physics. It's impossible. You cannot build this runway and maintain your climate change commitments unless other parts of the economy, like people's heating at home and transport, have to make unparalleled cuts. It's simply not possible. And the Climate Change Committee have agreed with that this week.
Actually, if I may say, yes. The best thing we can do is actually to save rainforests, because that will do much more than anything we can do here.
Both. We can do both.
Yeah, we can, but that does so much more.
And what do you say to the trade unions, Len McCluskey?
Look,
Labour support who wants...
And I understand why Len McCluskey and Unite want to have those trade union jobs. They're looking out for the interests of their members and their members to be. But as a potential Labour government, we have to look out for more than just trade union members. We have to look out for the interests of this country and our place in the world. And we have an obligation to countries in the developing world who are already seeing global temperature rises of an average of 2 degrees centigrade already. Okay. They're already feeding climate change.
The man in the check shirt there, yes.
Back to the point that Suella made about developments within aerospace technology, well, not aerospace, but you know what I mean, aviation technology, becoming more greener, becoming more efficient, things like that. It's the same with, like, electronic cars. Back along, we were all going horse and cart, then to petrol and diesel, which has now fallen back a bit. But
what's your point about aeroplanes?
Well, the point is, of course, when they get more efficient, which they are doing, and as everything does, it will keep getting more efficient. It may not be on the cards at the moment, but again, electronic cars weren't on the cards. It's going to keep getting more efficient.
Are you in favour of the new runway?
Yeah, it's going to get more efficient. It won't necessarily be that good in the beginning due to the emissions, as you're saying, but it will get better over time with the air quality.
I'll take one more point up there from the woman in green in the front row of the... Yes.
When you build roads, car usage rises. When you build another runway, there will be more traffic. There will be more pollution. It's simple mathematics.
And you're against whatever case is made for it in terms... I mean, the way that it was put by Johan.
I think I agree with Clive. We have a duty to the whole planet, not just to the economic well-being of this country.
OK. We'll go on, because we've got a lot more questions. I'll come to it. I'd like to take this question from Daniel Smith, please. Daniel Smith.
With little time left and a cabinet in open warfare, are we heading towards a no-deal Brexit?
All right. Clive Lewis, you start on this.
I genuinely hope not. It'll be a disaster for this country. I mean, but it does feel that we've got a government that's committed to a kamikaze Brexit. And you look at Theresa May's cabinet, it's like someone's thrown a hand grenade in there. They've gone all different directions. You've got people, you've got Greg Clark, who seems to be in the Alamo, the only person of some kind of sanity in there, who's asking for a soft Brexit, whilst everyone else around her seems to be asking for something for the no-deal Brexit, which is going to be a complete disaster for this country, for jobs in this country, for the economy, and for our standing in the world. Look, this is one of the most difficult things this country has faced in the post-war period. And I remember, after that referendum vote in 2016, my party, Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell, and the leadership of the Labour Party put their hand out to the Conservative Party and said, this is a mess. How do we work our way through it to keep the 48 and the 52% together? But this government chose hubris and the attempt to try and dominate the argument, to interpret what the referendum meant, and went down their own path. And now look where we are. What a mess we're in, and what a catastrophe we're heading for, unless this government pulls its finger out and actually starts to deliver the goods that this country wants to see, which is a successful outcome to these negotiations.
Then do you, just briefly, do you still want the British people given a chance to ratify, as you put it, or reject the deal? In other words, a second referendum?
Labour Party's position on
I'm
that...
asking you your position.
Well, I'm quite low down the food chain, David. You don't really want to know what my position is.
I wouldn't ask you if I didn't want to know what your position is.
You must have one.
You want to say what your position
is. It's on my
problem, not what...
OK. Well, our position is that we will not be having a second referendum. What we want to see in Parliament is a meaningful vote, something that has been denied by this government to Parliament. The executive...
You're wrong. You said
you
that a
haven't
second
given us a
referendum is
meaningful
the
vote.
best way to stop Brexit. Be honest.
You
Come on,
haven't
be honest.
given us a meaningful vote. Parliament should have been given a meaningful vote. You stopped that, and that's disgrace. And that's a reality. We could have had Parliament helping negotiate, helping work out how we get out of this, and you have denied Parliament that chance.
All right.
That's wrong.
But with the amendment on Tuesday, I believe Parliament will get that opportunity.
It won't be a meaningful vote, though, as I understand it.
Well, I mean, I thought Clive was going to be a bit more honest tonight, but he's been very honest on Facebook and on social media, where he has said that a second referendum is precisely the best way to stop Brexit. So I don't really follow what you're saying tonight, Clive. There's a lot of points that you've raised here. I'm very confident that we're going to move towards a mutually beneficial free trade agreement. That's definitely what the government wants. That's what I want. I don't want a no-deal scenario, but we do have to prepare for it. There's mutual interest for both the UK and the EU to strike a tariff-free arrangement on goods. The EU Council, Donald Tusk, has said that very thing, that he wants a zero-tariff arrangement on goods, so that companies like Airbus and BMW can continue to trade their goods into the EU and vice versa. When we leave the EU, we will become the single largest market for the EU.
But the question isn't about your views on the market. The question is, the Cabinet is in open warfare and there's little time left. And are we therefore heading towards no deal, which you incidentally said is something we'll capitalise on?
Yeah,
well, I'm not scared. No deal is great for us, you say.
I'm not scared of no deal at all, but there's a lot of points there.
Do you want no deal?
I just said I don't want no deal. But what's important here is we have to keep no deal on the table. I mean, Johan, as a successful businessman, when you're buying a house, when you're buying a car, when I'm buying a pair of shoes, at the market, you need the freedom to walk away in a negotiation. Otherwise, that's the best way to get a dud product. And if we...
OK.
You're haggling for.
How is the Cabinet going to reach agreement? Because the question Daniel puts is that the Cabinet is in open warfare, which it clearly is.
I think that it's very good that we have a healthy debate, and it's really this is the democracy that we live in. But let's be clear. I mean, we have just passed a milestone piece of legislation in the form of the EU Withdrawal Act. That has pretty much united the Conservative Party, unlike the Labour Party, where there was three-way splits all the way. There were only 79
we want
rebellions.
a jobs-first Brexit,
Jeremy
we want to be in the
Corbyn
customs
tweeted
union, and we want access to the single market. That's quite clear. That's a pretty unified position.
Janet Street Porter.
Yes, it
I
is.
think most of the public look at the goings-on in Cabinet and they just can't believe what's happening. I feel that most of us feel like we got on a coach, a magical mystery tour, that after the referendum result was announced and, OK, we're going for Brexit, it's like we've gone round and round and round and roundabout, and the driver of the bus, Theresa May, isn't anywhere nearer to getting to a conclusion. And the result of that has been that it's bred enormous frustration in the public at large. It's led to things like the march last weekend, where people are now asking for a second referendum on the terms. It's tragic, really, because we can't go forward in this country running democracy on a series of referendums. So every time we have a referendum, we don't get the result we like, we're going to have another referendum. Well, that's plainly ludicrous. Government should work in a democracy. We should trust and empower our MPs to carry out our wishes in a civilised and dignified fashion. But sadly, they are offering no leadership at the moment, and you can just sense the anger in the country.
The person in the blue shirt, and I'll come to you afterwards, yes.
Does the panel not agree that the Conservative government is currently wasting our time a great deal pursuing options that the EU has already rejected on areas such as the Irish border?
Helen Lewis.
Yeah, I do. There are two options currently on the table being talked about, one of which doesn't exist anywhere else in the world, and one of which doesn't exist, as far as I can see, in reality. And that's the level of debate that we're having. But look, I've been a political journalist now for 8 years for my sins, and during that time, I was told repeatedly by the Conservative Party two things: they believed in fiscal restraint, and they were the party of business. Fiscal restraint, it turns out, went out of the window as soon as they paid off the DUP to be their partners in supply and demand. And we've had comments from Boris Johnson that I cannot even say on this programme about what he believes about businesses' warnings. And I think this is really worrying. Suella, when you were on this programme last time, you said the divorce bill, the idea we'd pay a divorce bill, was Project Fear. And guess what? It's collided with reality. We're going to pay a divorce bill. You know, why on earth would we trust the government on anything when we've just heard these things colliding with reality? And reality has won every time.
And I'll tell you about reality. The reality is that step by step, we are moving out of the EU. We have triggered Article 50. We have struck agreement on the implementation period on EU citizens, an exhaustive and comprehensive package. We have passed this milestone piece of legislation, and we are now talking about our future relationship. Judge the government by their outcomes, which is this progress, not by headlines or scaremongering.
Progress. So, are you saying they're not split? I mean, Jean-Claude Juncker said today, I think, we can't go on living with a split cabinet. We're working on the no-deal option.
Everyone agrees in the cabinet that we are leaving the customs union, we're leaving the single market, we're leaving the ECJ jurisdiction.
I found that quite hilarious comment, actually, by Juncker. Now, I'm Swedish and I'm British. I came here 34 years ago. I love this country, and I want this country to get a fabulous deal, because we deserve it. I don't want us to mortgage our future. Okay. That said, I've spent my life negotiating. And the one thing you do when you negotiate is you figure out who has the most to lose. And this is exactly the situation here. Who has the most to lose? So if we look at a no-deal scenario, because that is what it means. So if we have to fall back on WTO tariffs, over the next 10 years, together with the exit bill, that will add up to 250 billion pounds in our favor. Okay? After 40 years, that's equivalent to our national debt, give or take a little bit. So these are not small sums of money that we have on the table that we give up when we do a deal. And we should leverage that. We should actually take advantage of the position that we have, not appearing split, not negotiating with ourselves, with Parliament, but act as a unified force behind the Prime Minister, give her the tools to negotiate the best possible deal.
OK, so Johan, what do you make of big business like Airbus this week, for instance, saying it would reconsider investments in the UK?
I think that is Monsieur Macron calling up the CEO, Mrs. Merkel telling the chief executive of BMW and Siemens. Those arguments don't carry much weight to me, because you don't move a factory over a 3% tariff.
But Siemens is a British company.
And
You're saying they're rung up by Brussels and told to say this?
Because the guy who runs Siemens is a very clever guy, and he wouldn't say that unless he was told to say so by somebody very important. And I can tell you,
he's very clever, so he'd only say something he didn't believe in if he was told
to support
to say
his country. To support his country, yes.
Siemens is a British company.
Siemens, at the end of the day, is a very German company.
We've got to remember that these companies made similar predictions and threats about us joining the euro and about the referendum result. Airbus did say they were going to make moves out of the UK if we had voted to leave, and they didn't. We've got to keep these warnings in perspective and actually judge the economy as it is now. Since the referendum, we've had 600,000 new jobs created. We've had a growth in the economy. That's what happened. Yes, but it was all predicted that we'd have a recession just after the vote, and that didn't happen.
Let's come back to Daniel's question, which is about how, with a cabinet and open warfare, you get any decision. You, sir, in the blue shirt in the back row up there at the top.
So, Suella, you mentioned earlier that businesses need to prepare for a no-deal scenario. I just wondered what you actually mean by that, because I work with businesses every day, and the way that they're planning on dealing with a no-deal scenario is to carve out their EU business and go to another EU country. So,
what kind of businesses do you work with?
Well, a variety of SMEs that import from the EU, that export to the EU, and if they've got to all of a sudden wait a day for their goods to come through the port at Dover, then why would they stay in the UK?
And what do you make of the way the negotiations are or aren't going at the moment?
Oh, it's a shambles. It's an absolute shambles.
All right, and you say here.
Which is pointed out to Clive there. Why don't you get your heads together with Labour and work with the Conservatives? We voted to leave.
Yeah.
Let us leave. All right? That is the answer. Now, the other thing is, right, why should the EU dictate to us, a very big nation, of what we can do or what we can't do? I think that is a load of rubbish.
Who's doing the leaving?
Yeah?
Who is doing the leaving?
We are leaving, yeah, and it's the best thing that'll ever happen to the United Kingdom. I can tell you that.
All right. The woman in the front row here.
When I drive into Exeter, I come through a trading estate which has one road with 11 garages that's supplied by Europe. Are you telling me that they're going to stop doing that? That's a load of rubbish. We get a good deal because they will want it.
We are the second largest market in Europe. So, of course, people are not going to stop selling here.
There are 1.5 million jobs in Germany that depend on the UK for trade. We buy more from the EU than the other way round. They need us just as much as we need them for a mutually beneficial...
We have a 100 billion trade deficit with Europe.
There is a possibility that we will all lose from this, and that's what we're staring at in the face at the moment. And there are two ways to go into a negotiation. You can go into a negotiation in a cutthroat manner to try to do the other person over, or you can go in and say, OK, how do we sort this out so that we can both move apart amicably, but remain as trading partners and friends, because we're neighbours, we need each other, we rely on each other, and let's go about this in a way of cooperation. But when people talk about this as if it's a poker game, or as if you're haggling for a bag of sausages or something, these are people's lives we're talking about. There are people that are going to lose their jobs. There are businesses that are going to fold. Do you not understand that? Rees-Mogg and his millions, and people who are hedging against the pound and speculating, they might not be affected by this, and their ideological purity will remain intact. But working people in this country will pay the price for your incompetence and your ideological purity.
The woman there.
We've been talking a lot about how Brexit is going to affect the UK only, but it's not just ourselves that's going to be affected by it. A lot of international development charities receive funding from European bodies, so the amount of aid that's going to be available to spend on international development and supporting developing countries is going to be affected as well.
Yeah. Let's just come back to the business issue and these businesses that have been saying, it's going to damage us. You've got BMW and you say it's all... The business secretary says the businesses put evidence before ideology, an actual experience of trading, not a theoretical view. Are they right?
I think we need to listen to businesses, but we need to keep their worries in perspective. And as I said, if we look at what the state of business is at the moment and looking into the future, we're seeing manufacturing order books at record highs. We're seeing more and more exports growing faster than imports. That's good for British businesses. That means the demand is increasing. But it's really important that we raise our game, that we have confidence in our achievements as businesses in this country, and we look forward to the opportunities from Brexit, because there will be many good opportunities for businesses, for jobs, and for the nation.
And what about your Foreign Secretary saying expletive deleted?
Max Fax business.
Well, he's explained himself, but I mean, as I said, we shouldn't follow blindly.
How has he explained
He said yesterday that he does sometimes use colourful language when to express
the issue,
himself.
the principle is a very important one, which is it doesn't matter what business says.
Well, I think we have to listen to businesses, but we mustn't blindly follow them, and we've got to keep in perspective what they say. And I believe that sometimes businesses do overreact and they don't get it right. So the predictions that were made by Airbus about the euro, the predictions that businesses were making about the vote were not proved.
What about trade unions? You like to quote Len McCluskey now. So trade unions this week have also come out and said that this will negatively impact on working people in this country. So, you know, it's not just business. There's a whole raft of different organisations and groups and trade unions who are saying this is bad for our country, and the way you're handling it is jeopardising our livelihoods in the future.
And do you know what's actually going to really hurt working people, Clive? It's the Labour Party policy to keep us in the customs union, because the EU customs union actually makes our food, our clothing, our shoes more expensive.
So what's your alternative?
By leaving the customs union...
How are you going to save the peace process?
By leaving the customs union, we have the chance to set our own tariffs on New Zealand lamb and Vietnamese shoes and goods from South America. That's what's going to help poorer people to increase their affordability.
Right. We're going to, very briefly, because we have to move on.
One very important point to both of you is that if we're part of the customs union, we can't do our own trade deals. And if we can't do our own trade deals, it also means we have to follow European regulation like we do today. So at that stage,
we're a rule taker from Donald Trump's US or from Canada. I mean, because ultimately, in an international, globalised world, you will become a rule taker from someone. And I look at European values, and they're a lot closer to ours than the US or some of the countries that people like Liam Fox want us to do trade with.
No, let's look.
The woman up there in the middle next, in black and white, yes. Yes.
You talk about business, but actually it's a lot more than a business problem, isn't it? There's a huge human cost. Now, I'm talking about my Polish husband that I used to, when I was 23, I used to travel to Poland on the train, and the dogs would come in and look at you and sniff out the spies or whatever. So that's a huge benefit to us, that you can travel to Poland and back without check. Two of my children are married to EU citizens. They're young people. They haven't been married very long. One of them is saying, well, we don't know where we can live. Where are we going to be able to live after Brexit? So there is more than just money concern. And you say as well that we voted for Brexit. Well, not all of us did. A substantial number of people...
Just before we leave you, are you alarmed at the divisions in Cabinet about this? Does that worry you, that the Cabinet is divided about this?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Are you worried that the Cabinet is divided on this issue? The government can't decide which way to go at the moment.
Well, I absolutely am worried, and I'm also don't really understand why if we can't get a deal, why we can't walk away from Brexit.
Okay.
The people's vote. That is what I would like.
All right. We'll move on, because we're here week after week. I want to go to another question that came up this very week. Alex Hall, your question. Serious issue too.
Do you think that it was right for Gavin Williamson to demand 20 billion more for defence?
Helen Lewis.
I feel I'm about to use some unparliamentary language, not as bad as Boris Johnson's, but I really felt this was Willie waving, or Williamson waving, perhaps you might call it. We already spend 2% of GDP on defence. That's the NATO target. France doesn't hit that. Germany doesn't hit that. Obviously, the US would like everyone else to spend more because they have such a disproportionately high military spend. But there is absolutely no way, as far as I can see, that the military comes higher up than schools or the NHS, which, as we all know, is going to get this illusory Brexit dividend. And to me, it just seemed like basically Gavin Williamson saying, hello, I'm still here, by the way. I'd still like to be Tory leader, rather than having anything to do particularly with our military capacity or needs.
You said earlier you've been a political journalist for 9 years. Did you hear about this remark on Theresa May, where he's meant to have said, I made her, I can break her?
Yeah, I think he's watched a bit too much House of Cards. That's my theory. He's got the tarantula and he's kind of doing the Francis Urquhart thing. So, yeah, I mean, you know, it's a stiff competition this week to be the scariest member of the Tory cabinet, but he might just have edged it.
Janet's reporter.
Yes, I was at a party in Westminster last night, and a lot of MPs were there, and suddenly into the gathering strode Gavin Williamson, and quite honestly, he's got all the gravitas of a wet flannel.
How much?
I agree with Helen completely. I just thought this was a shameless bit of headline grabbing. Perhaps he's trying to redress the balance after his disastrous remarks about President Putin when he said, what did he say? He should go away.
Shut up and go away. But it was a
up.
Defence Committee report that talks about the need for more spending. It wasn't just Williamson.
Given the huge gaps in our economy and, as Helen has said, the need of the National Health Service, I cannot see why we should spend more money on defence. If you look at technology and how we are going to conduct and wage wars and espionage in the future, we will need less manpower, less gadgets, less boats, less planes and less hardware, less boys' toys. Wars and intelligence are going to be carried out by men and women sitting at computer screens, and it's going to happen in a completely different way. So the idea that we need all this money and people, I do find a little bit mystifying. When I look at the new advert for joining the Army or the Navy that's on the television at the moment, it's still propagating that outmoded idea that you join the Army and it turns you... What's the last line of the ad? I'm just a lad from Blythe, but the Army or the Navy it makes me into a man. And you just think, no, in the future, I hate to tell you, wars are not going to be fought like this.
You were a soldier, Clive Lewis. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, I find it quite ironic that the individual former Chief Whip, who spent years whipping his MPs through Parliament to enact austerity cuts to our defence forces, now finds himself in the position where he's pleading for more money for defence. Look, Labour has said that we'll make the commitment of 2% of GDP, which is a NATO ask, an average, which is what we'll do. But the thing for me here is that where he seems to have been defeated is on the issue of soldiers' pay. And it just strikes me, as someone who's served and has friends in the army still, who have served, who put their life on the line, there's too many people, too many MPs, too many Conservative MPs in particular, who are happy to talk about boys with toys and F-35s and new aircraft carriers. But when it comes to the people who fly them, who are on the ships, the people, our sons and daughters and brothers and sisters, when it comes to giving them decent pay, decent terms and conditions, decent housing, the money isn't there. And that tells you all you need to know about this government, I think, when it comes to
And the Commons Defence Committee, which is a cross-party committee, that means nothing to you?
No, it does. And I think the former chief of the General Staff, who was on the Today programme this week, said, look, there is a very legitimate conversation to be had about whether we want to increase the spending to 3%. There is an argument that you don't do it. And he was very grown up and sensible about it. I think we need to have a look at what future threats are and what our defence capabilities need to be. But let's be quite clear here. Perhaps having a foreign policy where we're not the policemen of the world, where we're not starting illegal wars in the future, not bombing Libya into a pulp and causing states to fail, then maybe, just maybe, our defence bill wouldn't have to be so high.
Suella.
Well, much like Helen says...
The question is, was he right to demand 20 billion?
Well, I think this does happen quite a lot in the run-up to a spending review. The Chancellor sets the limits on departmental spending, and in the run-up, lots of heads of department put their bids in. So I can definitely see why any Secretary of State might want to push for more money. Every Secretary of State, I think, would like that. But I think that we need to be careful here. I think we need to have a balanced approach to the finances. We can't just make spending commitments that can't be met or which are not sustainable. We have committed to a 2% of GDP of defence spending every year. That's increased by 0.5 every year, and we spent £1 billion on defence. And we've had some really big developments with 2 aircraft carriers and renewing our nuclear deterrent. We've got a sustainable force at the moment which is deployed and which is making a difference around the world. And I think it's a bit rich of Clive to talk about more spending for soldiers when it was actually a Labour government that left our defence budget in a parlour state with a £38 billion black hole.
That's rubbish. That's absolutely rubbish.
I'll come to you. The man in the white shirt there in the third row.
I just want to go back to what Helen said earlier about the Conservatives claiming they're the party of fiscal restraint. And, you know, fair enough, you've caused a lot of austerity recently, but with Gavin Williamson's demand for 20 billion for defence, and yet, you know, who spent 1 billion on just keeping himself in power when you've lost your majority government, and now Theresa May is claiming, you know, 600 million a week as a Brexit dividend. How does that make any sense?
What's your view of it?
I don't see a problem with an increase in public spending, but I just think you need to be honest about it with the people like Labour are.
And on defence, you'd have it?
I don't think that's necessary.
The woman in pink there, what would you do if you were in charge of all this?
I would spend more money on police and intelligence services, because I think that would do our defence, be better defence for our realm.
Okay. Johan?
I agree completely with the lady in pink, I think it is. I think we're very good at intelligence. In fact, probably the best in the world. Our cyber capabilities are second to none. What MI6 and MI5 does is incredibly impressive, and is what CIA wants to do, the French DGAC and lots of other agencies, who are very good at that. But let's face it, post-Brexit, our defence is going to be a very important part of our foreign policy. So we need to keep that strong. Now, I would say one thing we should look very careful at is value for money. And that's across many sectors of government and spending. Same with NHS. Value for money. We need to spend the money in the right way, not waste the money. It's our money that is being wasted. So do we want that? No.
Okay. You.
I think what Janet said earlier about the fact, well, suggesting that in the future it could be more cyber war. At the moment, soldiers are still in the field, and if they require more money, then they need more money.
Okay. And I'll take one more person at the very back, on the right there, at the back row. You, sir.
I think one issue that can't be forgot is the fact that veterans are coming home and they're sleeping on our streets at night. Yeah. That's the most disgusting thing to come out of any rich country like ours. Forget the party politics, any of that. That comes first, and then we look at boosting our army. That is one thing that never should be forgot.
Okay. And just before we end, we had one question we haven't got time to go to, but I'll give it to you and you have a yes or no answer. President Macron is bringing back national service for a month for 16-year-olds. Do you approve or not? Yes, no, yes, no.
No, I'd be terrible at it. That's my rationale.
Right. What's your view, Suella?
Well, we have national citizenship service, which
this
is an amazing
a compulsory 1 month.
I'm not in favour of
You're not.
compulsory.
Are you in favour of it?
Yes.
You are. Are you in favour of it? You
Brilliant
are.
idea.
Good, brilliant idea. What do you say, Clive?
No, there are much better ways.
What?
There are much better ways of working with 16-year-olds.
OK. So we've got 2 in favour, 3 against. I'm sorry to the question, we couldn't put it because our time's up. So, next week, we're going to be in King's Lynn. And in King's Lynn, we're looking forward to having as many people as possible from Norfolk coming there. We're going to be with the Secretary of State, the former Secretary of State, Priti Patel, and Owen Jones, the Guardian columnist and Corbyn supporter. Those are just 2 of the 5 who'll be on the panel. If you call 0330 123 9988, you can come to that programme, or you can apply via our website, which is there. Now, as ever, on BBC 5 Live, Adrian Charles, if he's not talking about the football, will be able to discuss what we've been talking about on Question Time, and you can push the red button and see it on the telly as well. But here, my thanks to our panel, to all of you who came on this very hot evening to this hot studio in Exeter. Many thanks, and until next Thursday from Question Time, good night.
Well, here on BBC One next.